everyone. So if you watched my last video, it was on area of rectangles. But today we're going to talk about area of composite shapes. All that means, it's a fancy way of saying that there's more than one shape in the picture that we're discussing. So let's take a look at our first problem. If we look over here, it looks like it might be a little bit challenging to figure out what the area of this shape would be. But let's do what we know. We know how to find the area of a rectangle. So I'm going to draw an invisible line, and we represent invisible lines with dashes. So I'm going to draw an invisible line over here in order to separate this into two rectangles. Do you guys see that? Great. But I know I can see this right away. Can anybody tell me what the area of this lower rectangle is? If the height is 4 and the base is 5, we go 4 centimeters by 5 centimeters, and that would be 20 centimeters squared. So we have the area of that bigger rectangle. But what about that small one up there? We have the length, but we don't know its height. We don't know how tall it is. But let's think about what we do know. We know this entire side over here is 8 centimeters, but we're only trying to figure out from here to here, right? So if this part is 4 centimeters, because remember yesterday I said that this is the same as this, so if this part is 4 centimeters, how many more must this be in order to make 8? That's right, 4 centimeters. They're the same. Obviously my picture wasn't drawn quite so well, but yeah, it's 4 centimeters. So if the height is 4 centimeters and the length is 3 centimeters, we do 4 centimeters times 3 centimeters, which gives us 12 centimeters squared. Now, that gives us the small square and the big square, but I'm not asking for how much this small square is and how much the big square is. I want to know what is the area all together. So all we have to do is add those two areas together. So the area of the rectangle is 12 centimeters squared and 20 centimeters squared, which is 32 centimeters squared. If you notice, my units don't change when I'm adding, only when I'm multiplying. So again, when I'm adding, I still keep the same unit. But when I'm multiplying, that's when it changes. So I did the big square and the small square to equal the entire thing. That might have seemed a little confusing. So let's do the next one. Let's do that one together. So again, this one's broken up. I'm going to erase this so it's not distracting. This one is broken up into 2 rectangles also. I think you guys can see that, but you can also break it up into 3 rectangles if you wanted. Take a look. 1, 2, and a big one, 3. Or you can break it up right here. And then you'd have 2 rectangles. You have a long one, and you have a taller one. So you can break it down any way you want, and that's okay. So let's take a look at the first rectangle, the top one. That's the easier one because all the information was given to me. So I know the length is 4 feet, so 4 feet, and the height is 6 feet. So 4 feet times 6 feet, that gives us 24 feet squared. Now, let's do the bottom one. Well, I know the height, but I don't know my length. I know that this is 2 and this is 2, but how big is this in the middle? Do you remember how we discussed the sides are the same and the top and bottom are the same? So if that's 4 feet, and that's 2 feet, and that's 2 feet, how much is it all together? 2 plus 4 plus 2 is 8 feet. So this whole base over here, the whole length, is 8 feet long. Now, how do we find the area of this big long one? Well, we have the length or base and the height giving me 8 feet times 3 feet, and that is 24 feet squared. Actually, they're the same area. Interesting, right? I think that's kind of cool. And now, I'm not asking how much an individual rectangle is. I want to know how much they are together. So, let's add the top rectangle and the bottom rectangle. And when we add them together, whoops, forgot the squared. When we add them together, we get that the area of the composite shape is 48 feet squared. Okay, now I'm going to take a second to redraw the pictures on the board. I'll be right back with you. And we're back. So, let's start with problem number 3. Now, let's look at this rectangle over here. Where would you draw a line to separate this as to 2 different rectangles that we can figure out the area? Oh, looks like I had a volunteer help me out on that one. So yeah, you could have drawn your line there. Where else can you have possibly drawn a line to separate it as 2 rectangles? Well, it's not straight. He's absolutely correct. Here, pass me that marker back. You could draw a line here, or you could have drawn your line here. Whichever way you draw it, I promise you, you'll get the same answer. So, what is the area of this small rectangle over here? We have 9 yards. 9 yards is the height, and 5 yards is the width. So we'll go 9 yards times 5 yards. And what's 9 times 5? That's right, 45 yards squared. Remember, we need that little 2 up top to say we multiplied yards times yards. Now, let's do the bottom one. We have 7 yards here and 9 yards here. So, we have 7 yards times 9 yards, giving us 63 yards squared. So, how do we find the area of the entire composite shape? We add them up. 63 yards squared plus 45 yards squared gives us 3 plus 5 is 8, and 6 and 4 is 10. 108 yards squared. That is the area of the entire composite shape. And for the last one, we have to figure out how to separate this one as 2 different rectangles. Okay? So, I can separate it at 2 different places. I can draw my line here, but then I'd have to calculate what this is. So, let's see, what if I separate it right here? Do I have any calculations that I need? No, everything is there for me. I see my length, I see my height, I see my length, I see my height. Everything is there. So, let's do our first one. 8 yards times 9 yards, which is 72 yards squared. How many of you got that? Great, so glad to hear. The next one is 6 yards times 6 yards, which is 36 yards squared. And just like before, we want to make sure that we know the area of the entire composite shape and not just the individual rectangles. So we have 72 yards squared plus 36 yards squared. Remember, when we add, we don't change our exponents. Now, 2 plus 6 is 8, and 7 plus 3 is 10. Wait a minute, that's kind of cool. My area of those two shapes were exactly the same, even though they looked really different and seemed to have very different dimensions. That can happen a lot. So, these are composite shapes and how you find the area of composite shapes. You have your worksheets that you're going to do as independent work, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye!